Okay, so this is part 2 for Parshat Bo. Um, so we asked basically a few questions. I'm not sure that the camera was recording, so I'll just repeat very shortly the questions we had. We had these 3 things that were said about Choshech, and each one of them sort of has a little bit of a difficulty. Because we can't understand, at least not at face value, why Choshech is being singled out compared to all the other um, uh, cases. Okay, so yeah, okay, fine. Sorry for that. I'm just trying to make sure that this is actually being recorded. Okay, so the first part had to do with the fact that the Egyptians were being punished for not accepting God's authority. The second part had to do with the fact that God had to seem to have to consult with his angels about giving them, striking them down with choshech. And the last one had to do with the fact that the angel that brought upon the darkness added a little of its own to this whole story. So, what does all this mean? Um, I think this all goes back to what I said before, that choshech is a special plague, in that it doesn't seem to cause on its own any damage. It's just uncomfortable, and it's also pretty scary. Meaning, if there's any kind of impact that it has, if we had to try and explain what its sort of purpose is, or what is the factor that it brings into play in God's plan with Egypt, it's there to basically strike fear into their hearts. It doesn't cause any kind of real damage except for a few days of lost work, right? Other than that, though, it doesn't do that much except for block out the sun, which is pretty scary. And sort of psychologically, it's very powerful, even if physically and technically it's not such a big deal. And I think that Chazal were trying to understand what is the purpose of such a plague. If really this is what it is, what does it mean? And in that context, let's look about what it says over here. Let's first talk about. I think that Chazal basically were trying to say the following thing: that after all the plagues that preceded Choshech, God was all ready to strike them with Becholot, with the plague of the firstborn. They had seen enough, they had understood enough to know that God is special, and as we talked at the beginning of the previous video, that sort of God has already educated them to understand that He is beyond what they've understood, that they must bow down to Him. Now, God's original plan, so to speak, of why doing the plagues had to do with letting the people of Israel out and doing it in a way that drove home a message to the Egyptians. But in the process, in order to drive this message home, He had to reveal Himself to the Egyptians. He had to show them what He was. And so even though this whole process is there to make the release of the Jews final and clear, so that there's no doubt as to what is generating, why they're being released, and why there's no point in fighting, in the process, the Egyptians also were faced with a choice that had almost nothing to do with the Jews, had to do with their relationship with God. This is a people that were exposed to God's full force. Now, you'd think that after that experience they would accept God's authority, right? But they didn't. Now, that wasn't the purpose of the purpose of the plagues wasn't to force them to accept God's authority. It was simply to make them understand who it was that they were facing. When they finally said we're not releasing the Jews, then God would bring upon them the plague of the firstborn and punish them for what they've done all these hundreds of years. But in the process, they learned about God, and so at the end of this thing, before God gives them the final strike, the plague of the firstborn, He says, but wait a second. As human beings, forget about the fact that you're tormenting my people. As human beings that are exposed to me, you should have, by this point, recognized and accepted what I am. And you're not. And for that, you deserve a special punishment. Now, this is not about, destroying your crops. You might say that the crops were being destroyed so that they didn't enjoy the slave labor of the Jews. That would mean that the entire process, the plague, let's say, of the hail and locusts, all had to do with making sure that they realized that enslaving the Jews won't help them. But darkness had nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with the Jews. It now has to do with God and the Egyptians. It's personal. But not personal like the plague of the firstborn is, where God says, my child is Israel. My child, my firstborn is Israel. So if you don't listen to me, your firstborn will die. Because that's about Israel. This is personal about God and the Egyptians. Another people which were given a chance, perhaps in unfortunate circumstances, to see what God's strength and power and grandeur really was. And they decided to turn away and not to accept it. And so that's, I think, what all these midrashim are talking about. Let's see. So the first one talks about the fact that they deserve to be punished because they didn't accept God's authority. Well, that makes sense at the end of the process. And that's it's focusing not about Israel. It's nothing to do with Israel. It's about them and God. And that they had to accept His authority. And they didn't, so they need to be punished. The second thing has to do with God consulting with His angels, saying they deserve to do this. And they all agree. And then that also relates to that part about about the darkness adding a bit of its own. What is that about? Why does, in that story of a king who orders his servant to give 50 lashes and the servant adds 100, adds another 50 to get to 100? Why does the servant do that? If you think about it for a second, what is the reason to do that? I mean, the king told him what to do. The king is giving a just verdict, let's assume. So why add of your own? What is it that you gain from that? And assumingly, we're not talking about a servant going to suck up to the king, because God is the king in this story, so there's no point in sucking up to him. What is the reason that a servant would do that? The only reason why a servant does it is if they see that as a personal offense. If I am so attached to my king that I get offended when he gets offended, then I'm going to add my own. I'm going to say, you deserve more than that. This is now personal, right? But not personal from God to the person, but from the servant to the person. What's being said there has to do the same thing with the angels being involved. God is basically saying reality has to basically take revenge on, come to sort of demand that the Egyptians pay a price, because all of reality stems from God, and if you do not accept God after all you've seen, then you don't belong in this reality, so to speak. And so the angel of the darkness is saying, I'm personally offended, not because of the darkness, but because I'm part of this world, I'm God's servant. And how can you ignore him after all you've seen? How can you continue to deny what it is that you're seeing there? I'm so upset myself. I'm so offended myself, says that angel. I'm going to add a bit more. But that's there to try and show that it's personal, okay? That it became personal between God and the Egyptians. So basically, to summarize, what this midrash is saying is this, is that even though the story of the 10 plagues has to do with God trying to release the people of Israel and do justice and make sure that the Egyptians realize what they've done to Israel and where they stand relative to God, all that is true, yes? But in the process, you can't ignore the side effects. And the side effects have to do with the fact that by being exposed so much to God, there was another demand from the Egyptians to change near the end, once they really understood what happened, and they didn't. And as a result of that, God brought upon them another plague, the 9th plague, plague of darkness, which was there. It wasn't there. It wasn't part really of the original sort of. It's not part of the same. It's not the same style as all the other ones, because it's not designed to do the same thing. It's not part of sort of evening the scales of payback for what they did to the Jews. This is payback for their ignoring God. And when the time comes for that to be paid back, then reality itself comes and says, we can't allow this to go without our personal intervention, because these people simply don't deserve to be part of this reality. We have to punish them extra. We're going to go with the extra effort. So God consults with those angels, and when they do finally do what they do, they take, they add their own twist to it as part of the punishment. So that's basically, I think, what's being said over here, and I hope you all have a good Shabbos.